Fantastic. So uh, tonight I thought we'd talk about auras, mostly because it's one of those topics that I think a lot of people are interested in, and I have been on a journey with auras. I need to share that. When I first sort of started to look at this esoteric stuff and the all this stuff that we know that we're all interested in, I dismissed auras in the way it was presented to me, and I also dismissed chakras in the way it was presented to me, and I'll explain that as we go along there. Um, I think you'll see why I dismissed them and then why I got interested in them again and why I'm currently thinking the way I am. One of the things that I like to share with you guys is the fact that, a lot of things I talk about are part of my journey in the sense that I've been in and out of these topics and my thinking changes and evolves. Let's say evolves depending upon the people I talk to. Um, so let's just think a moment about this thing called an aura. Um, that is the frontispiece, the opening page of a book called The Human Aura by a late 19th century theosophist who was exploring this idea. And I just think that's quite a nice picture. And the concept is clearly that people have around them these auras and that they can be detected by sensitives, and they have often been ascribed colours, which mean specific things. Now, if I'm sounding superficial and dismissive, it's because I want to get into a bit more detail in a moment, and I am not dismissive of this concept. Um, in our language, we have this acceptance that people can feel blue, people can be red with rage, and this connection between colour and emotion is there. And what I found interesting, the more I dug deeply into this, is that there's a whole branch of colour psychology which actually is, for the want of a better phrase, scientific um, understanding of the effect of colours. So why not? Can't there be a mystical understanding of colours, and can the two meet? Which is where we're going to go in a moment. Um, the thing about auras is that they're perceived as being external manifestations of the current state of the individual. And actually, if you go back and do your sort of due diligence on finding this stuff, Aristotle um, was talked about this kind of external cosmic body was the mediation between the material self and the spiritual self. And that is a real interesting question to start a discussion on, isn't it? Because if I accept I am a spiritual being, then where do I physically end and where do I begin spiritually? And I think the history of spiritual uh, philosophies is full of ways of explaining that connection between the material and the divine, for want of a phrase. And one of the reasons I got turned off auras initially was because I thought, for me, the thinking wasn't there, it wasn't clear, it was a bit muddied with all kinds of other stuff that got thrown in, as we'll see in a moment. One of the great Christian thinkers, Thomas Aquinas, also suggested that there was a subtle intermediary between the physical and the spiritual. And this idea of having an aura about you, a spiritual aura, of course, is perhaps what the halo in religious paintings represents. The halo, the kind of drawn around saints and holy people, irradiates their divine connection. Now, what I love is that the word aura, the Greek word aura, actually is a term for a gentle breeze, an aroma, a breath, or an emanation of some sort. And I kind of like that kind of description, that perhaps on a spiritual level, when we're in the presence of other people, their um, so we say their spiritual self breathes information to us. Um, and of course, if you're into Greek mythology, Aura was the winged nymph, was one of the daughters of the god of the north wind. If I say to anybody outside now, if I went down the street and said, you've got a nice aura to somebody, it would generally be understood that I am sensing or commenting on something that is connected to them, that is part of them, but maybe not physically them. And so the word aura has leaked into common usage. Um, and it's also, therefore, muddying the waters when we try and talk about auras spiritually, perhaps. Okay. Um, Now, I'm not going to get all sort of Vedic and Eastern on you, but one of the things that we could possibly address is that most of Western mystical thinking actually is an adaptation of Eastern thinking. So things like auras or koshas um, in Eastern philosophies or and in yoga, and chakras, again in Vedic teachings from the East, have more clarity about them when they're discussed by the people who are from those traditions. And in terms of the Vedic tradition, there are perceived to be five energetic layers around the body. And they contain this sort of sense of self, the bliss body, and there are connections to the cosmos. And if you look at that diagram there, you can see the five sheaths, koshas, these five layers that are part of our connecting to the spiritual. One of the things that put me off auras and indeed chakras when I first started to read about them was that many of these Eastern ideas, these Vedic ideas, these ideas from ancient yoga, had been westernized. And in their westernization, had become a little bit more clinical and a little bit more fixed than many of the Eastern teachers had taught and shared. So if you're really interested in this stuff, have a look at your Vedic literature from about the 6th century BC, where some of these thinkers were wrestling with this idea of what is the soul, what is the physical, and what is the cosmic and universal. So 5 layers here. The reason I'm talking about this is I think that this is where the Western concept of aura came from. All right. And one of the things, as because I bang on about it enough, is that it's incumbent on all of us to honor our sources. So if I'm going to quote something from the Eastern tradition, I can adapt it, but if I honor where it came from, then that for me is satisfying. It's the same thing I talk about when we talk about borrowing shamanic ideas um, from other cultures. I'm not a Native American Indian, so for me to wholesale borrow Native American stories and traditions without honoring where they come from, I think is spiritual theft. But that's another story. So here we have this idea of energy bodies that surround the the human body, the physical body, and when whereas that initially they were talking about 5 koshas, the development of that was the idea of 7 aura bodies. Forget the colors that are there at the moment because that is a Western interpretation. Just these 7 aura bodies, which are levels or components that are seen as being how we connect back to the cosmic source. Okay, and interestingly, in the Vedic literature, these energy bodies are aligned to physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual conditions. So, if we are becoming complete individuals and, should we say, liberated individuals, it's not just the physical we need to balance, it's the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual, which is where that new age fascination with holistic comes from. Again, the word holistic for me is an oversimplification of the spiritual disciplines that it draws upon. But as long as we are on the same page with knowing that we are more than just our physical selves, there's something else going on, then I think we can actually have a discussion and share stuff. In the Vedic literature, the seven bodies are identified as this. There is the physical body, which is a kind of outermost layer, physical form. Then there's the pranic body, which is the life energy, the chi, the prana. Then there's the mental body, which is our thoughts, emotions, and mental processes. Then there's the intellectual body, which is about understanding and the ability to analyze and interpret information. I, when people are sort of talking to me about holistic approaches, they often would want to miss out the aspects of the intellectual self, because I in the past have been accused of thinking too much, and that's possibly true, but I'm exercising that part of my spiritual, emotional, intellectual self that I think needs to be nourished. So the other three parts of the body are the spiritual body, and then the astral body, and there's a lot there about astral travel, and then the higher self. So these last three are the bits where we are talking about sort of connections to higher forms or higher aspects of ourself. It's the stuff that comes out of this recognition of these seven bodies that I find really interesting. And you will no doubt have read of people talking about astral travel. Well, in this particular context, what are we talking about? Are these people who talk about astral travel talking about connections at an astral level, a spiritual connection, or are they talking about traveling to some other physical place? Now, I've heard it used in New Age communities in both ways. People astrally traveling to visit their uncle, not in a spiritual sense, but in a material sense. And I don't have a problem with that. I just think it's an interesting way that that term is being used. If you're into your horror story literature and have you read any Dennis Wheatley, who wrote The Devil Rides Out, The Devil a Daughter, amongst other horror stories? One of the protagonists, a guy called Duke Durishlu, is constantly traveling to the astral to battle the baddies in order to redeem other people and save them from their souls from damnation. Again, I find that interesting because that whole concept um, in the Dennis Wheatley novels actually did filter down into what people believed magic was in terms of ritual magic. The idea that we're battling the demons on an astral plane, which may or may not be true. Um, and I think it's really easy to see how the seven layers of the aura got tied into the idea of the seven chakras. Now, this is where I'm being a bit careful because in the Vedic literature, the traditional literature this stuff comes from, it doesn't only talk about seven chakras, it talks about numerous chakras, anything from 3 to 800 chakras, these energy centers. And the system that we have adopted in the West, I'm not saying it's not meaningful, by the way, because once you adopt something, it can have its own meaning. But the system we've adopted in the West is the 7 chakra system, because it fits quite nicely with the 7 aura system and also the 7 colors of the rainbow. And it may surprise you to know that all of the stuff that most New Age uh, people talk about, people in the New Age community talk about, all that stuff about chakras and auras didn't come together and wasn't fully connected until about 1977. True, some of the ideas come from earlier than that, from the 1940s and 50s and 60s, but the full westernization of the aura and chakra system can be seen as being codified, if you like, in the 70s. Now, I'm not saying that that is invalid, by the way. You see, just because something is new, just because a tradition is new, doesn't mean it's invalid, because the people using the tradition give it meaning. However, when people use the word traditional, it's useful to know where their tradition is coming from. Okay, so that date may shock you to a little bit. It shocked me when I started to look up this, and I had to check that several times. And before I put this presentation together, I went back and checked that. And most sources say that all the associations of the chakras with their, um, you know, the endocrine system and with the limbic system and with all that kind of stuff that we now know about didn't really come together in any codified form until 1977. It was floating around in other bits and pieces and other bits of teachings, but wasn't pulled together as a complete system until then. And whereas the chakras are said to be internal energies, the auras are external manifestations of energies. So if we do trace this chakra idea back, although everything was sort of put together into, if you like, a referenceable source in 1977, actually the 7 chakra system came across in the 1880s and was developed from that point. And it was theosophists that mostly did, and yoga teachers who took the Eastern systems and made it palatable for the Westerner. Yeah? And so in 1918, a guy called Arthur Avalon, whose real name was John Woodruff, wrote a book called Serpent Powers, and he associated the chakras with nerve centers. And then by the 1920s, chakras became linked to the endocrine glands. All right. And 1927, that's when the colors were first put into the chakra system, the 7 chakra system by a guy called Charles Ledbetter, who was actually a theosophist and quite an influence and a mentor to other spiritual people that came afterwards. I like the allegory that the chakra is the emperor who turns the wheel, which is the Eastern allegory. And that for me reminds me to think about the fact that if I start to place the chakras in fixed places and assume that the energy is flowing either clockwise or anti-clockwise or in a knot around the Kundalini, they're all just reference points. They're metaphors for the things I'm trying to talk about. They're not a reality in that sense. I get to see that people will talk about chakras as being fixed spaces. And indeed, yoga talks about them in that way, as do many New Age alternative therapies. Crystal therapy, Reiki is another example where the chakra system is actually referred to. But again, interestingly, Usui didn't refer to chakras in his original teachings. And one of the reasons that we refer to chakras in Reiki now is that when Madame Takata, one of his students, brought the system to the West, not only did she Christianize it, but she actually adapted it to make it palatable to the Western tradition. And again, that word tradition comes in, which isn't necessarily about being old, but it's about being a system of organizing our thoughts. And that for me is an important distinction. The reality of a metaphor is less important to me than the use of a metaphor to structure, to offer a framework for discussion. So, the thing we do know about our language is that it evolves. A few years ago, if somebody said to me I was woke, then I'd assume I'd just woken up from a sleep. But that word woke now means something very different. The word, well, no, words full stop evolve. So if you start to look at the word aura and you look at the way that that is evolved, we know that in the Greek tradition it simply meant breath. Um, the word aura actually, if you trace it down, there's a wonderful um, thing on Google called Nigram Viewer. It's a digital tool. You can type in any word and it will actually show you the frequency of that word appearing in printed literature from the 1500s. So if you type that word in, type aura in, you will see that no mention, no mention, no mention. And then around about the 1890s, there's a sudden spike in the word aura in English, French, German, and Spanish and Russian languages. Yeah. In German and Russian, it didn't appear till around 1850, which ties in perfectly for that rebirth in spirituality that happened in the 1800s. I've mentioned this before, but we can look at the birth of many traditions, I've used that word again, from the 1800s when there was a spiritual revival. Um, you actually have in the 1800s, you have the birth of spiritualism, you have the development of Jehovah's Witnesses, development of Latter-day Saints, you have these growth in alternative ways of connecting. I think sociologically the reason for that, it was a backlash to the materialistic industrial revolution, okay? Because people were becoming more material, there was a counterbalancing of seeking out spiritual references. And as in the 1600s, when people started to gravitate towards, shall we say, Eastern teachings or more esoteric teachings, we in the West started to gravitate towards those older teachings to find some meaning or sense of place. Yeah. So we can mark the birthplace of the modern use of the word aura from the 1800s. Before that, it may have had different uses in terms of the feel or that person having a charisma or that person having a sense of giving off something that was powerful, energizing, supportive. Um, and we do know that there are people that are charismatic, that have this energy, I'm using that word advisedly, around them that people find attractive. And so that use of that word has always been there. That aura, that breath of fresh air that emanates from some people has always been there. But in the spiritual sense of tying it down to chakras and seven layers, really that's an evolution of thought, borrowed from the Vedic and adapted in the West in the early part of the 19th century, which I find is really interesting. So, if we assume for a moment that the human body does have an aura around it, what is it? Now, this is where we need to be aware that the word energy in spiritual circles is a different word to the word energy in scientific circles. You see, to scientists, and scientists don't know everything, but science is a way of describing the world. To scientists, energy is the ability to do work. It's a specific thing. Um, it can transform things, it can do some work, it can give us light, it can give us heat. That's what energy is. It's a, if you like, it's a verb. In spiritual circles, the word energy is often used as a noun, as something about something. Um, you can blame some early science fiction uh, in terms of perpetuating this idea that energy clouds mean exactly the same thing as energy of science. I mean, Star Trek is a perfect example of the 1960s, where they were constantly bumping into energy clouds or mists of energy, which was just an artistic or clumsy way of trying to describe what they meant. But it caught the popular imagination. So, if I assume, and I'm willing to accept, that around us, simply by the very process of us living, there is a energy field in the strict sense, electromagnetic energy field around us, then if I'm willing to accept that, then can we actually see it? Can we feel it? Now, the scientist would actually say no, because it's so small. The amount of energy we're talking about is minute, which opens the way for people like Cernwell and Carillion in the 1930s, who developed what's known as Carillion photography. He was able to show that if you place an object, an organic object, in a high intensity electric field, you could show an aura around it. And I'll show you a photograph in a moment of the aura around it. But the scientists would say, well, that's just the byproduct of that material acting with the electric field. The mystics wanted to see that as proof that this aura was really there. There's a photograph of an aura. I've seen the photograph. You've seen the photographs of something, but actually, can auras be measured in that way? And that's the big question. If you read anything about Carillion photography, you may well have seen images of where a leaf has been pulled off a plant and the ghost of that leaf is still seen on a Carillion photograph. And the challenge there is that you have to question how that photograph was taken and when it was taken, and are they trying to prove a point with it? In the 1980s, a guy called Dr. Guy Coggins actually developed something called the Aura Cam. And if you go to any New Age festival, you will probably find somebody with one of these devices where they take an exposure, usually a Polaroid photograph these days, and you've got your hand on a plate, and the aura that is shown on the exposure is a range of different colors around the body, and that's usually interpreted. Um, okay, the scientist in me knows that what the plate that you're touching is measuring skin resistivity. It's a purely natural phenomenon, and the machine, the photograph, is placing on top an interpretation of what that skin response and that pressure and temperature is showing. And if you dig deep within Dr. Kai Goggins' own work, he may sell these aura systems for tens of thousands of pounds, but that quote at the bottom is directly from him. The aura cam does not photograph the actual aura. There's nothing that exists that can do this. The guy was saying, my aura cam doesn't photograph the aura. What he does say is it gives an interpretation of the body's skin response, which can appear to be described as your aura. So the next time you go to a New Age festival and somebody's charging you 10 quid for a photograph of your aura, bear in mind that what they're photographing is the skin resistivity, which may or may not show a physical condition I'm not so sure it would show a spiritual condition, but obviously show an emotional condition. So, what do these things look like? Well, on the left there, that's a Carillion photography of somebody's hand. I will actually say that early Carillion photographies were not that colourful and certainly didn't look like that. And this particular one, I believe, has been retouched. It's not what you see, but that idea of that blue aura around the edge of the hand is the result of your hand being placed within an electro energy field, and it's the way that that photograph picks up the way your hand interacts with that energy field. It's not a photograph of your aura as such. On the right, there is an aura photograph that's taken by one of those aura cams. And the interesting thing there is I've never seen any of these auras where the aura photograph actually touches the body, but it is actually quite an interesting representation. It looks a bit like the photographs, the images we saw earlier of the layers of the human aura. Now, I'm not saying that interpreting the colors there has no value. It may well do, but it's not a photograph of the human aura, as many of us would like to believe. It's a photograph of something. It's a photograph of that individual's current physical, emotional state, perhaps. But I don't necessarily believe that it's a photograph of the aura around the body. But you may choose to believe that. That's fine. Um, for completeness here, the colors that are mentioned here are often the colors that are associated with the auras and the chakras, and in fact, every aspect of spiritual, material, physical connectivity. So, we have all that stuff about red is energy and spontaneity and passion and sexuality, orange is creativity. If you know the way that chakras are taught in the West, then you know that your base chakra is red. That's the root of your sexuality, your energy. The orange chakra is about where you transform emotions and so on and so on and so on. There's nothing wrong with this, by the way. It is a useful framework. The color system of the chakras is a useful framework. This particular color wheel doesn't come from a spiritual source. It actually comes from a psychological source because we are aware now, because science has done ask some questions about it, that psychologically we respond to colors. So if I enter a room that is painted red, I will emotionally respond to the redness of that room. Here's a funny story. I got really caught up with this color stuff. And I read some research about if prison cells were painted pink, um, there was less violence, less aggression. And the reason they still remain grey is that there is this kind of, part of me thinks there's a kind of macho thing about that. But I started to question what would happen if I was teaching people in different coloured rooms according to the activity. Well, bear with me. I was fortunate to be in a position in Cornwall where I was in charge of a department where we were teaching young people to become socially, personally aware. It was called personal and social education. And when the classrooms were redecorated, I had this notion that we could do a number of things. One was that we could actually make sure all the PSE lessons were actually on the curriculum at the same time. So there was a team teaching ability there. So there were 4 groups of PSE running and 4 teachers. And I could pick the teams of teachers or encourage the teams of teachers who were particularly either grounded or more emotional or would actually talk about these things that the kids related to. Okay. Some teachers were more open to talking about sex relations with education. Some teachers were more open to talk about thinking skills. right? So I got that in place where I had shall we say, a revolving list of teachers whose personalities best suited what they were delivering. Of course, we pushed their personal development, that is the teachers, by encouraging them to work in areas that they were uncomfortable with, but didn't force them to. And I took it the next step. They were redecorating the classrooms. So I thought, I'll have a red classroom, a yellow classroom, a blue classroom, and a green classroom. And in the red classroom, it was pale red paint on the walls, and they were red desks and chairs, red top desks and chairs. In the yellow room, there was yellow paint on the walls. There were yellow top desks and yellow chairs, and so on with the green and the blue. The rooms look fantastic. Now, the intention was that the kids don't spend their 50 minutes or an hour in that room, that single room. The activities changed because there was four classes on at the same time. They'd revolve around the four different rooms. So we may start with one group may start with a high energy activity in the red room and then move to the blue room to have a reflective time and so on. The theory was great, and for a couple of years while I was in charge of the department, it wasn't. It was just that I can maintain that rotation. Um, it worked really well. The kids actually enjoyed it. The teachers enjoyed it. But then I moved school, and the person coming in um, didn't have the same ethos as I did, and so classes were taught for 50 minutes in the red room, or 50 minutes in the yellow room, or 50 minutes in the blue room, and it drove everybody doolally. In fact, the only person that were really calm about it were the blue room people. The red room people, they found that behavior problems increased. They found that in the yellow room, people were off the wall. They were kind of like jabbering and kind of like spontaneously connecting with each other in a way that wasn't useful. So, and again, that was an interesting experiment. But my takeaway from that is that color is really important socially, emotionally, and environmentally. And the takeaway from the school was if we do something as crazy as in the first place, make sure the guy that's the crazy guy doesn't move away from the school because it needs it to maintain it. Anyway, let's build the point. This seven color sequence is the chakra sequence and is often related to the auras as well. Okay. This is the color sequence that if you have an aura photograph taken and people see the green band around your head, like in that photograph, that green there on the left there, well, that's that touch of social and acceptance and harmony and love. And this person here has got this vibrant pink, uh, almost calm red magenta area. Well, see where that fits on this. And that's how the interpretation is given. And that's how the interpretation is actually given in most of these aura situations. I was happy with my um, world of auras, therefore, that there was a psychological something that connected us, that I could feel blue and that I could feel energized and red, and all that was happening. And I knew the psychological effects of putting people into prisons of different color. Um, I also am aware that there is something around us that may not be photographable but can be sensed. And then I read or came across this lady called Vicky Wall. Um, she was, it says there, that she was appointed as the first surgical chiropodist in England and taught a lot. And unfortunately, as she got older, she started to lose the sight until eventually, before death, she was virtually totally blind. But she developed what is now known as the Aura Soma color system. And if you've again been to any of these New Age festivals, you will see bottles of colored liquid, usually two colors in a bottle, and somebody selling them as the cure all because these bottles relate to your auras. And I sometimes wonder whether the people who present these bottles and sell them at really expensive prices have actually read what Vicky Wall herself has said, because I read her book and I devoured it. Um, and it's really interesting because the way she was using these colors were these bottles of liquid, which were organic olive oils, essential oils, crystal tinctures, and herbal extracts. She made these bottles of colors. Now, bearing in mind, she was losing her sight. So she claimed that she was picking up something from the colors, which gave her a sense of their meaning. And in each bottle, she maintained that the upper color was the conscious self, and the lower color was the unconscious self. And the way Vicky Wall used this system, and people who've been trained by her use this system, is people pick the bottles they're drawn to. And as you said there, the colors you choose reflect your needs. So if you picked a bottle with blue on top, then your conscious is aware of the need for the blue vibe, which of course is that chilled vibe, that calming vibe. If it picked a bottle with a red bottom, then your unconscious mind is looking for energy and for passion and drive and so on. If you've not read this stuff, this week also, it is well worth a read because I feel that this isn't presented um, in a way, often isn't presented often in a way that echoes what she was teaching. It's more about where people have taken it. Like this bottle matches your aura, therefore you use it. So in many ways, Vicky Wall's aura soma system is a kind of reading system. It's a way that when you react to a set of colors, they somehow reflect your conscious and unconscious thinking and connectivity. And because they're reflecting that, the therapist, the reader, the intuitive can tell you something about your current mental, emotional, spiritual state. It echoes something developed much earlier by a guy called Lussier, Max Lussier, who developed a psychological color test. It's called the Lucia color test. Now, I use this a lot. Um, and his concept is basically the same that when people choose colors and they do it spontaneously, the color they choose and the color sequence they choose actually reflects something about them. It's been presented that the color you choose reflects your aura. That's not the case. It's the perception of the color that allows you to have a subjective reaction with it. Now, again, personal revelation number 444, I came across this, the Lucia Color Test, via a film. I like my films, and there was a film with Art Garfunkel, very old film. I think it had, oh, yes, and it'll come back to me in a moment. Very serious actor that was in The Shining. It'll come back in a moment. Those two starred in this film where Art Garfunkel played a psychologist, and he actually used this color test on all his girlfriends. The film was called Carnal Knowledge, and it was slated as a really bad film, but has since regained a certain degree of credibility because of it, because it's about the psychological interplay between people and their drives. But I came across this in that film, and then I went and bought the color test. You can pick it up for pennies now in bookshops, and use the test on myself a few times, and then I use it as talking points with friends, not to play any kind of game of carnal knowledge, but to actually sort of say, what does that relate to you? If you pick yellow, green, red in that order, and your preference is yellow, green, red, can the definition of the book tell me anything about you? And it's quite interestingly, as in most psychological tests, there is something in there that you can actually find that relates to you. So the reason I mention it is that this is not about your aura. but it's about our reaction to color. Both Max Lucia hit on this idea well before Vicky Wall, and Vicky Wall hit upon the colored liquid idea because she had a personal resonance with color, even though she was losing her eyesight, which brings us almost to the end. What I will say is that if you're really interested in look at this list of colors, this is the list of colors from the Lucia color test book. Um, so say, for example, you chose the color red as your first choice, and then you chose the color brown as your second choice. What that is really saying is that you've got this aggressive, competitive um, outer self, and the brown is saying that you're actually looking at your own body condition and does it match up to the energy you're putting out? There you go, quick idea of how it works. It's fascinating. I would recommend you have a look. I would say that this Lucia color test system and the Vicky Wall system are as interesting to me as the tarot is. And there's another story we can go into. So, can we sense auras? That's the question. Can we measure them? I think that the scientific photograph of auras is a long way off if we ever can. Because when we try to photograph the aura and measure the aura, uh, so much noise is creeps in, and the way that the software or the process has to interpret the electrical signals. However, anybody who is even slightly empathic can feel um, the behaviors of people and assign a color to it. It's easy. We do it red with rage. If you're intuitive as well as empathic, then you will possibly have a sense of colors around somebody, which is reflecting their current emotional, spiritual, physical state. And this is the one that's really, really fascinating. In very recent years, and I'm talking about the last decade or so, I've become more and more fascinated with this thing called synesthesia. Now, if I'm talking as a scientist, I know that we have five senses that are to do with perception, right? We see, we hear, we feel, we touch, we taste, we smell. And those five senses are important. And mystics have, for a long time, have talked about the sixth sense. And I used to do talks on this and say that if you believe in the sixth sense, you're dismissing possibly another 20 odd senses. Because in terms of science, there are at least 33, possibly 38 definable senses the human body possesses. It doesn't just have sight, taste, sound, smell, feel. It has a sense of temperature. It has a sense of perception of where you are in space. It has a sense of yourself within yourself. It has a sense of body, internal body sensations. It has a sense of danger in terms of survival. These other senses are known senses. What we forget to do is we forget how to translate those things in any way as an individual, and we just have a talk about them as a feeling of. Synesthesia is where people's senses are crossed over, which actually means that somebody can taste color. Some people can smell color. Some people can hear colors. What that is doing is their brain is learning ways and does have ways to make sense of the world around it from a very early age. And it has these abilities. Now, I, in common with quite a few other people, would suggest that we're all born with this thing called synesthesia crossed over senses. We're all born with it. But as we mature, our brains mature, it defaults to the common senses we need to survive. Only some people maintain that additional way of sensing the world. I was called into work with a child a few years ago, a number of years ago now, actually, who would hit other children when the classrooms, when the kids started talking in the classrooms. And this response was, the school called it an autistic kind of response, but they asked if I could actually help. And when I sat down and spoke to this lad, um, you know, they put him in a classroom when I went to the classroom to see him. He was sitting by the window drawing. I sat next to him and got a pen and pencil and I started to draw with him. And, you know, I looked at his and pointed his drawing. I put my thumb up and nodded. He pointed on my drawings, put his thumb down and smiled. There was rapport and honesty. And then I said, "Hello, my name is Alan." And he spit at me and went out to hit me. And I said, "Well, what's happening?" He said, "Your words taste funny." He had sound, taste, synesthesia, which meant that every sound was translated into a taste. And of course, what do we do when we have a bad taste in our mouths? We either want to spit it out, throw it away. And that's physically what he was doing, is physically acting out this sound, taste, synesthesia. I met musicians who, for years, brilliant musicians who played music and they've not really thought about it too much. And until you talk to them and you say, you know, that piece of music is lovely. And they say, yeah, because it's blue, because that note is blue. And they're not talking here like blues musicians. They see musical notes as colors. One very famous violinist actually sees the notes of the scale around her as a three-dimensional model of different colored lights. And the intensity of the light and the hue of the light tells her the note it's being played, but also the way it's being played. I met a guitarist he did a TED talk actually, who actually decided that he was trying to show people how he saw music. And he put lights on the guitar that matched what he saw. So when he played, what you were watching was a light show, but that's not made up. That's exactly how he sees the music he plays. So when we think about what senses we have and what senses we respond to, yeah, we need to remind ourselves that we are sensitive to more of the world than we think we are. We can respond to the world in completely different ways, and we've just forgotten how to do it. And yet, there are people amongst us with this condition called synesthesia, where their richness, their perception of the world is different and more profound than our own. When I looked into Vicky Wall in particular, it seems that she was a synesthete. She had this synesthesia, color feeling synesthesia. It is estimated that 12 to 18% of the current population are synesthetic. That is, they haven't uh, lost the wiring that makes their brains work in this particular way. So when I approach somebody and I feel an aura of greenness about them, that could well be a fossil memory of how I could, at one time, sense things around people. And maybe I can reconnect those wires. So when I look at people who sit and draw auras around people as terms of reading, part of me wonders whether those people are synesthetics, i.e., they're actually drawing the layers they see, or whether they're using some other system to get those colors. And I know a number of people who claim to be reading auras that are actually using numerology to produce the colors that they draw on the charts. That doesn't make the charts invalid. What it does do, it gives them a way of interpreting the numerology in terms of colors. But that's a whole new topic. So I've warmed again to auras, but not necessarily the auras in aura photographs, but in this sense that naturally intuitive people have always had this ability to sense the spiritual emotional state of the people around them. And I do believe it comes from a survival instinct way, way back. But I also think that it's actually still there. Now, if you're interested in experimenting with this, and I, in some workshops I used to run, I'd get people to stand against a white wall and then their partners to squint at them to see if they could see a change in the light pattern around them. And many people eventually start to see a fuzzy line. Now, that could be a visual thing or it could be an emotional thing. I don't know. You may have been in workshops where you've got people standing at either side of the room. And this is a really interesting experiment to do, actually. And you get one person to stand still, but think of an emotion, not saying what it is, and another person to walk towards them, and then eventually close their eyes and get as close as they feel comfortable they can. And I've seen this happen in groups when I have people are thinking negative thoughts or hurtful thoughts. The people that are approaching them with their eyes closed who don't know what they're thinking can't get as close or don't want to get as close as when they're thinking loving and welcoming thoughts. Now, I'm not saying that's an aura, but I'm actually saying that that is something, a vibe that the person gives off, and we all give those vibes off. So there we go. Some thoughts about auras, and I'm not trying to, if you want to use the chakra system and color system and auras around the body and color system, that's fine because it's a useful reference point for talking about other things. But a reference point doesn't need to be a fact. We use lines of latitude and longitude on the Earth as reference points, but they're not real. You can't actually go and trip over a line of latitude or well, that's not strictly true. You can trip over the Greenwich Meridian because that's a line in the ground that marks that, but you can't measure the other lines of latitude and longitude. You can't trip over them, but maybe you can sense them because they're to do with the Earth's rotation. Yeah, I don't know. Things for you to think about. But the system of longitude and latitude is a really useful system, enabling us to locate ourselves and each other. So just because it isn't a physical thing and I can't photograph a line of longitude doesn't mean it's not useful and doesn't mean it is not a valid framework. These valid frameworks are what we put in place to understand the world around us because the world around us can be really complicated at times. So there we go, guys.